Okay, so Scott Crow, you're obviously a very well-known activist here in Austin and worldwide. But just in case anyone is unfamiliar, why don't you tell us a little bit about who and what you are?
Man, that's always complicated because, like, what defines us, right? I'm a father, I'm a neighbor, I'm a worker. I subscribe to the ideas of anarchy. I've been a long-term activist. I've built worker co-ops over the years. I've been a musician, underground musician, using using music to talk about political ideas. So when people say that, it's always hard to say, well, what am I? And I think the label that's thrown on me lately is writer or author. And so that's what I do. And I speak a lot.
Sure. I noticed you used anarchy instead of anarchism.
Mm-hmm.
What is anarchism or anarchy, and why would you choose to say one or the other?
Well, for me, there's a difference between anarchy and anarchism. Any kind of ism starts to codify the language, the open-endedness of any ideas. And so when I use the word anarchy, I'm very conscious about it because that's really what I subscribe to, this living, dynamic set of ideas that are open-ended, that have many interpretations, that are philosophical, political, but really at its root are very common sense ideas that many of us engage in all the time, but we don't even name them as that. And whether we call it anarchy or not doesn't really matter to me, because I know like historically, and I know tons of people now who engage in their communities in these ideas, but they don't use the word anarchy. But anarchism for me is something I definitely want to get away from, because then it starts to be like Marxism or socialism or any political or philosophical ideology, when you just try to shove these broad open ideas into a ballot box, into a party, into a leader, or into this box and say this is what it is, because it's not that. And I want to make a very clear distinction of that, because it means a lot to me. I use anarchist, I've self-described as an anarchist in the shorthand, but it's not because I subscribe to this ideology. What I like is what David Graeber had said, is anarchy is something I do. It's a way of seeing the world.
Is anarchism about rejecting rigid ideology?
In the first step it is, yeah. Yeah. But everything is, right? Like, even if you didn't have a political reference, all of our, like just growing up, if you have any consciousness at all, the first thing that you do in social development is a rejection of everything that's before you. For some, it's easier because it's like religion, right? As the world frame that you were forced into, or recognizing that corporate culture. Those are easy ones, and you reject it. You're saying, I'm against this. The second phase in development, and if we want to frame it, I'm going to frame that social development in political terms, is that you move to the phase of like figuring out what your identity is. And it happens with young people mostly, like in the late teens and early 20s or mid 20s, whatever, we're trying to figure it out. But in political circles, it happens at all ages, when people kind of, become conscious of things and they want to join movements. And so, but in that phase, that's where you start to figure out, who am I? And we start to have affinity around those that we think. Maybe it's like queer people or libertarians or whatever the subculture is, and then what happens, hopefully, is the third phase, is where you begin to go, like, I'm sorted out who I am. I'm more than just a political reference for an identity. I'm not just a straight, white, bisexual, whatever it is. Like, those are just political containers. And then you begin to ask the questions, what is it that I'm for?
So, is anarchy as an end actually possible?
No. Anarchy as an end is not possible. But in saying that, it's still an important way to view the world, because really what is at the root, what is anarchy? It's an absence of recognizing that we have our own power, and recognizing that nobody should have power over us, whether it's authority figures, the state, economic engines, anything. What I would call, from a Latin American tradition, power with a capital P. Those who have undue influence on cultural, social, political, and economic systems. It's not a secret cabal of people, but any of the institutions, the bureaucracies, the government, media, hedge funds, any of the players that have undue influence. And for me, at its root, anarchy is really about just casting that off and recognizing that I have my own power, and that we have collective power together, and that we want total liberation, and that we don't have to wait on others to create that liberation, that I have to do it myself, and that I want us to work together to do it together, because I want liberation for everybody, humans, non-human animals, and the natural world.
Right.
Did that even fucking answer the question?
No.
I totally spun off. Shit.
No, that did.
Yeah.
What I'm working with in my head recently is total liberation, like in its absolute sense. Yeah, it doesn't exist and it
Right.
isn't possible.
That's right.
But we are striving for it nonetheless.
That's right.
How do we get from our current condition to where we want to be?
I want to come back to that, because I want to answer the second
No
part
problem.
of that. So is anarchy achievable? Well, I think to degrees it is, right? If I can get free in my own self, and then I can and I can work with others who are also trying to get free, I think that's a basic step towards liberation. Not rights within the systems that others have created, but creating liberation on our own terms. And this is not just for white dudes like myself. This is for people who have been marginalized under power, under these systems of oppression and exploitation also. And it's not because I'm benevolent and I want to work with them to help them, but it's because I want them to have liberation on their terms, just like we all need liberation on our terms, because our struggles are tied together. Now, what does ultimate liberation look like? I don't know what that is. And I think there'd be a lot of arrogance for me to say that I know what it looks like. But all I know is that what it looks like today, it won't look like in 5 years. It won't look like in 20 years, because it's like bubbles rising to the surface, right? It starts to change, it starts to grow, and once it gets to the surface, it's totally different than when it started down below. And that's what we're doing, is we're building and exercising power from below, outside of economic institutions, electoral institutions, and even outside of activism. So with the anarchy I want, the framing of that is like we begin to try these other paths if we don't even know what the answers will be, and I'm okay with that.
Okay. Can you go in a little bit to what those paths might look like, or what your ideal way of going about it would be?
Well, for me, I think that in the most immediate terms, we have to recognize that many of the systems that we engage in where we want to have systemic change are broken. Activism in the United States, I would say, is pretty broken as the way it is, just as much as we want to complain about capitalism or whatever other economic systems or the state or any of those things. I would argue that the modes of that we engage in are also broken, and that we should begin to see ourselves as more than activists, or more than voters, or more than consumers, like I said earlier. And I think this is an important distinction to make. This is not semantics. I'm not trying to make myself feel better. I'm actually thinking, like, I've engaged in activism for 30 years, and really some things are better, right? There's more rights for different marginalized groups, but the systems are still there, and they've consolidated power. Corporations are more powerful than they ever were, and I would argue that some governments are much more powerful than they were, even when I began. And wars still go on. The wars on poor, the war on women, the international wars, all of these wars still are continuing. Because because the modes that we are using, activism, haven't been able to not only confront and challenge, but offer alternatives. So what I would say is that first we recognize the systems are broken, and then the second piece in that is to say, what are the immediate steps we want? And that would be, for me, what has been coined as dual power. So dual power actually comes out of this old Soviet tradition. Lenin wrote about it, but somewhere along the way, anarchists reinterpreted it. And really, what I'm using dual power to say is that we resist on one hand, but we also create and build on the other hand, and that any actions that we take must do both. And if they don't do both, we don't engage in them. So activism and the modes of activism are often about resisting the oppression that's happening or resisting the exploitation that's happening. But all they're trying to do is stop the bleeding or stop the dam from breaking. They're not actually going, what other alternatives are there? We're like plugging it up. We're great at being fire brigades. We're the first ones on the barricades over and over again to say, this is wrong, this is wrong. And that needs to happen. But what's happened is that we've atrophied going, what is it that we're for? And how do we get there? And I think dual power, if in our actions, our immediate actions, is a step towards that to go, before I take this action, can we frame it in dual power? Is it building and resisting at the same time? And I'm not saying that every single action has to have that, but many of the actions that we have, because if we begin to ask that, we might say there might be actions we don't take, right? Like like in activism, often we talk about educating people. So like let's talk about policing, right? Policing, everybody knows the police are corrupt. All across the world, the police are corrupt, and they always have been. So what are we educating people on? We don't need to. What we need to do is to stop the tide of young black people being killed, black and brown people largely being killed, but we need to start to also, dual power would offer up, say, what are the alternatives to policing that we do? What does community control look like? What does it look like to have our own localized rotating, accountable groups that take care of ourselves? What does it look like to get skill sets and to mediate conflict, which is what the police do a lot. Again, there's whatever the examples are, there's a lot of that stuff. And so dual power is the first step. Another big piece in that, I think, would be the ideas of recognizing that we don't have to have the answers in anything that we do. So any of the proposals that I'm making or any of the explorations that I'm in, I'm not saying this is the way we have to do it. I'm just saying, what if we try these things? And I talk in abstracts to degrees, but if you know my history, it has to, like, I'm not sitting in an ivory tower. I want this to make sense to the brother and sister on the block, to the guy at the corner store, to my mom, to people who are not steeped in activism or leftist subcultures or any political subcultures of any kind. But recognizing that we don't have the answers, to me, is a step towards that, because I think it's very alienating. And it's very much continues the power dynamics already, where presidential people or party leaders or leaders of any kind tell you, like, yes, if it's 1, 2, 3 steps, if we do this, it's over. But I would argue that maybe we say we are going to try some new paths right now, but we don't know what's going to happen. An example of that, even though they consider themselves anarchists, but again, it doesn't matter about the branding, is the Zapatistas who rose up in Chiapas, Mexico in 1994 on January 1st. They're indigenous people who have been facing 500 years of exploitation and oppression, whose children were dying by the thousands for things that should not have happened in Mexico. And they said, ya basta, enough. We will rise up. And so what they did was they rose up with this non-deterministic politics, this idea that they frame as Zapatismo. And basically they said, like the New York Times has dubbed it as basically the first postmodern revolution, because instead of like rising up with guns to seize state power, which is the typical way to do it, they said, no, we're rising up right here to build autonomy in a region for ourselves. And people, political activists, politicians, nobody saw that coming. Nobody 5 years before that, 10 years before that, 20 years before that could have said this is what's going to happen. So that's an example of non-deterministic politics to me. And now 25 years later, since they've been above ground and creating autonomy in the region in Chiapas, Mexico, throughout these little regions, they still say we don't have the answers, and they've dropped programs and projects they had started and built other ones, and they have changed the way that they engage in things, because it's a constant evolving thing. What if that was to happen here? That's an amazing set of political ideas, and they're not the only people. They didn't invent that. They're just taken from other traditions. So I would hope that we would challenge ourselves to begin to look at models like that.
That's awesome.
Holy fuck, man! That was long. I'm like, I was starting to feel like Chomsky, where like I'm holding people captive, like trying to get to the goddamn point or something. Except we'd be here for 45 minutes on that question, right? And then he comes back to what it was about. So, the Common Ground Collective was I was a co-founder of a project called the Common Ground Collective, which began after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans and in the Gulf Coast region. I would argue that it was the largest anarchist-inspired organization in modern U.S. history. And I don't say that to toot my own horn or anything, but to give people context for it. And Common Ground was a very different organization and network that really evolved in the immediate aftermath. And we organized with an anarchist framework, basically power sharing ideas. We wanted the state to stay away from us. We didn't need their help or their hindrance in the work that we were doing. And the ideas were basic. There's three basic ideas. One was to build infrastructure that had never existed in those communities before. The second reason was to rebuild the infrastructure that had already fallen down, because disasters, like immediate disasters, like an environmental disaster, we can see it. But there's the slow disasters that have happened under capitalism that are very much more invisible, like when schools decay, or there's no access to medical care, or everything is corporatized and we just don't see it, And so so in New Orleans there had been some infrastructure obviously built over the decades, and it had just fallen down, and so we wanted to help rebuild that. And the way that we'd frame it, the third piece of that, was the idea of solidarity, not charity. It wasn't that Common Ground came in to lend a helping hand because we were so benevolent. We said we lent a helping hand together because our struggles were tied together. Even though I didn't live in New Orleans, I was there in solidarity because I wanted to help them to build power on their own terms. And so, taking from the Zapatistas, taking from anarchist traditions, it's like, if somebody is oppressed, if the boot is on somebody's neck harder than it is on mine, then we must struggle together against that. And what happened what I saw in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina was the absolute failure of governments at all levels, the failures of corporations at all levels, because it was a disaster. It was a man-made disaster on so many different levels, and the government response at all levels was just an abysmal failure and criminal neglect. And really, it was 20 years of political organizing and experience and making mistakes that had brought me there, as well as personal relationships that I had built with people working on prison issues, political prisoner issues. So it was a little bit of personal as well as political. I mean, I saw what was the failure of what was happening on TV. So you have to understand that the storm came ashore on Sunday. The levees failed on Monday. Martial law was declared Monday afternoon, and I was there on Wednesday, and I could see with my physical eyes, driving 8 hours from Austin, what was happening is that there was tens of thousands of people were left to die. And I think that that's unimaginable for young people to think about, or for many of us in the United States to think about, because that's something you hear about in other countries, but you don't hear about. But tens of thousands of people were left to die. There's no food, no water, no evacuation plans, no way to get people out or to help them. And so I saw this. And if I could back up for a minute, the reason that I saw it was I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001. And what I saw was very similar. It wasn't terrorism, that's not what I saw. But what I saw was that I watched power fall. That invisible stranglehold that's on us all the time, I watched it completely give way, but I had no idea about what to do with it or how to think about it. Like, I mean, when I was in D.C., martial law was basically declared there, but I got to watch it. Like, they lost the stranglehold. They didn't even know what was going on. So when it happened again 4 years later, after Hurricane Katrina, I saw the same thing. But this time I was much more prepared in my head, because I've been trying to think since the late 90s, how do we build things? I've been building worker cooperatives since 1994, but I was like, how do we build things? That infrastructure, basic infrastructure, like the Black Panther Party called it, survival programs pending revolution. Basic infrastructure like healthcare, education, food security, things that civil society needs. So I kept thinking, how do we build survival programs pending liberation, total, complete liberation? So when Katrina came and I saw the aftermath, I saw it differently, even if I still didn't have the answers. So I said, let's dream big. They've lost control of everything. They've left tens of thousands of people to die. Let's come in and help these communities rebuild themselves the way that they want to. And so we'll do it in an anarchist framework. So we'll do power sharing within. We'll call anarchist networks. And so drawing on all these anarchist networks that have been built around the alternative globalization movement, street medics, legal defense teams, activists, Food Not Bombs, people, we were able to start these anarchist networks were able to come in, and we were able to build distribution centers and health clinics and all this. But at the same time, because we were working in dual power, we were resisting the white militias and the police who were killing black people in those communities. We took up arms against them, not in a macho way, as part of community armed self-reliance. And it was 2 white guys from Texas and 3 black guys from the neighborhood started it, and then other black people joined in, and we had these armed patrols. So this was a resistance part to stop them from killing people in the neighborhoods, but also at the same time we were building. And taking a page from the Zapatistas, once civil society, people like yourselves began to come, and we had the protection of the media, we put the guns away because we weren't trying to build a standing army. And we had no capacity to do so anyway. And I didn't want to end up in armed firefights. I mean, like, the reality, what I wanted was for these communities to build controllers for themselves. So when we build these institutions and these projects, we wanted communities to take control of them. Free schools, neighborhood assemblies. I mean, there's like, that list goes on. And so when I say that Common Ground was the largest anarchist influence organization in modern U.S. history, it's because we had 28,000 to 35,000 people come through in the first 3 years. A scrappy organization that was not a nonprofit raised $3 million, $5 and $10 and $30 at a time. We didn't even have a bank account. And the reason that people came was not because we were so awesome, but because we created this liberatory atmosphere where it wasn't just like, you're going to help people and leave. We were like, no, we're here to help you build your power. And so what we did was we would go into community after community, even though they weren't even there might only be a couple of people in those communities, and we'd say, what is it that you need to help build your power? How is it that we can help you to get your leg back up? Because every community didn't need the same thing. Every individual didn't need the same thing. Unlike the Red Cross or FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management, they were just saying, one size fits all. Everybody gets. We didn't do that. We're like, well, they need medical care over here. Well, they need food right here, like immediately. And over here, they just need they need electricity to get things back on, to take care of these kids and stuff. There's kids running around. They need schools. So we, working in dual power, we helped a school to open by cutting the locks on it, walking past the riot cops. Common Ground volunteers walked past, opened that school up. The Common Ground didn't open the school, but we took the first steps, But at the same time, we were building free schools all over in multiple communities, temporary free schools, so kids could have something to do. That's a dual power framework. And so these are some of the things that Common Ground did. But internally, we worked on power sharing too. Like, how is it you have general assemblies with 400 and 500 people to talk about these things? People from New Orleans and people not from New Orleans. How do we have an anti-oppression analysis or a collective liberation analysis to mostly white kids who are coming from out of town to learn about the historical oppressions in these communities. Common Ground volunteers took direct action over and over again, which is a very anarchist principle, which is that you don't wait on governments or corporations or somebody else to do the right thing. We take actions to do the right thing when we need to. If we see a problem, we fix it. If we see a need, we help take care of it immediately. So we did these things, and this made us enemies of the governments at all level. In fact, they consider us enemy combatants to a degree. And so there's all this is going on. But I tell you all this, and it sounds beautiful, and it is. But all revolutions are messy when they're in the middle of it. It was like it's terribly messy, and it wasn't always beautiful, and it wasn't always glorious, and it wasn't always an amazing thing. So I want to be clear about that. We still struggled with the same things, like hierarchies of oppression and obliviousness to things, even knowing better, trying to. Because when you're practicing liberatory ideas and you're stretching, we're all practicing and stretching. It's there's going to be mistakes along the way because we didn't grow up in this, and so that's also part of the legacy of Common Ground. But Common Ground did amazing things at the same time. I'm not going to take it away. Like, I can't take it away. But like all good revolutions, that crack in history opened, and what Common Ground did was try to open it wider. And the crack in history is what the Zapatistas say. We saw a crack in history. That's what I saw after September 11th. That's what I saw after Hurricane Katrina. But we couldn't keep it open long enough. And so after 2008, it began to close. And so Common Ground still exists today, but it's much more of a traditional nonprofit. I wouldn't say it's anarchist in scope at all. So the question for me, or that I get asked, is that a failure of liberatory ideas? And I would argue, no, it's not. It's just the way it was. It's just what happened. in July of 2005, I wasn't even thinking about something like Common Ground. Well, and in 2007, I wasn't thinking that it was going to come to an end. It's just part of the history of the way it goes. And but that's part of the real legacy of it. But Common Ground still exists. I still have things to do with it. I'm not part of the organization anymore. But that liberatory moment opened for a long time, and they worked hard to close it so that power could take control again, and that's what they did. But New Orleans is still there. It's wider, it's wealthier, and smaller than it was before. 5,000 units of public housing were demolished. They've only built 1,500. New Orleans had about 500,000 people. There's only about 350,000 people. So where are all those people now? These are the questions I always carry with me. So the idea of power building is recognizing that we do have power, right? The 1% is really small in this world, right? But they exercise undue influence, right? Again, through bureaucracies, through media, through governments, through all of these things. Like there's undue influence, undue power. And so dual power is one framing of that. But really what we often do in activism is we appeal to power. We try to get them to stop being so bad. We try to get them to stop doing shitty things. But what I would like us to do is begin to think about exercising our power and building our power from below. Because they will not stop doing what they're doing just because we ask them to, or we become riotous enough. We can riot all we want. They will just clamp down further and further. And I'm not saying that there's no space for that, because we need that, right? But we also need to exercise and build our power. And so what does that look like in our communities? And I don't know what the answers are, but I think that we begin to build it on these liberatory principles, these liberatory ideas that you might want to call anarchy. Some people call agorism. It doesn't matter. That's a whole different concept, because then you're like, oh, I do have power. We do have power. And we begin to build, if we begin to work together, and not just so that we can appeal to some authority figure to stop it, but we begin to go like, well, this is ours. This is what it's going to look like. This is how we're going to do this. Even if we don't know what that means, and we make mistakes along the way. And so like an example would be after Hurricane Katrina, when we were doing that with Common Ground, we didn't want to build these things so that we could try to appeal to power so they would do the right thing. We did do that to degrees, but really we wanted to take a few blocks and say, this is ours, motherfucker. And we're going to delegitimize the state, and we're going to maintain this. And this is where we're going to build liberation, not for some white guys from Texas, but with the people from those communities. And so that was the thing. Of course, it collapsed, and then we built it differently. But that was the dream. Because remember this: everything that we think that we know about reality is only temporary. Right? We're born into capitalism, we're born into these hierarchies, we're born into all these things, and so we assume that they've always existed this way, but they haven't. And like they might exist continuously in our lifetimes, but they won't. Capitalism, as we know it, will fall someday. I'm not a soothsayer, I don't know if it's next week or whatever. So what do we want to do to begin to replace it? And also the other thing is, like I mentioned earlier, is that disasters, whether they're ecological, economic, or war, which are all legitimate disasters, are changing the landscape of the world. Climate change is changing the world. For some people it's an abstract, like maybe us here in Austin, Texas, is an abstract. But if you live on the coastlines, like there's Vietnamese communities in the United States, fishing communities, and all these communities along the Gulf Coast, they never moved back because their communities were gone. They were small, but that's going to be much more regular. That's going to become more of the norm, and there's going to be mass migration. So what do we want? Do we want to let fascism take in and build it, or do we want to begin to exercise and build power from below, these hyper-localized communities that are networked, where we have control of what we're doing? And again, not even knowing what those are, but just based on liberatory ideas. Social justice is actually trying to fight for rights within systems that we didn't create. Because the systems that were created and have evolved under capitalism and governments the way that we know them today, especially in the United States, I will speak to, are unjust. The balance is unscaled, where a few can benefit off the exploitation of humans, non-human animals, and the environment for profit, basically, for money. and power, which is all, it's all interrelated in that. And that, so social justice is the framing of that. We want to try to stop or lessen the exploitation with that, which is important to do, but that's different than liberation. I want to make sure that that's different. Liberation, so social justice would be the Civil Rights Act. Black people being exploited and oppressed for 400 years. Somewhere along the way, somebody said, "Hey, slavery's wrong, and why are we doing this? This is people." So they said, "Okay," so they said, "We won't do that anymore." But they still didn't have any rights really gained or that, except they couldn't be treated as property as such, right? And then, I'm not going to try to get all the nuts and bolts of it. Just an example, so just follow me. By the time the 60s rolled around, it's finally that they wanted rights within that. They wanted voting rights within that. But it didn't challenge the system. And so social justice, that's an important piece, right? So it's a piece of that. For queer folk to be able to get married, that's rights within it. That's social justice. For us, for recent immigrants to cross the borders and be able to treat it with dignity and respect, that's social justice, and not being treated as lesser than non-human animals. That's social justice. But none of those examples are liberation, right? Liberation is when those communities, whether they self-identify as those communities or it's shoved upon them, they create liberation on their own terms, right? So like for me as an anarchist, I would love to erase nation-state borders as we see them, so that migration happens back and forth and there's no criminalization of it. We figure out what that looks like. For blacks, it's as an example, so liberation is not the Civil Rights Act, it's actually creating black power, not over white people or anything else, but their own self-determination to determine their own futures the way they see fit, without me telling them, or governments telling them, or anybody else telling them, because we don't know better. I'm not saying that they would all be on the same page just because it's an ethnicity, but I'm just saying that's a start for that. Same for queer folk or trans folk. They have to create liberation the way that they see fit without somebody else telling them to do that. And then what I would hope is that we'd have communities where people are creating liberation that is not based upon exploiting some other community in that. I'm not saying there won't be conflict, but again, we begin to do that. And liberation looks totally different than just getting rights within the system. Conspiracy theories are shit. They're a total absolute waste of time. What they do is they divert us from the real issues that are at hand. There are absolute conspiracies that happen, right? There are governments, like certain sectors of governments that plot to do things, right? Like the overthrow of other governments, corporations colluding together to keep prices up. Those are real conspiracies. So if those are real conspiracies, why do we have to create these other conspiracies that we never will find the end to? I'm actually a poster child for a conspiracy, and that's one of the reasons that made me think about conspiracies a lot more, is that because I've been under so much heavy surveillance, what happens usually is that by the time the governments at different levels have spent all these resources and all this time to do it, they've gotten indictments, and then they start to it would go to court over it. But what happened in my case was unusual, is they couldn't indict me. So they tried on 3 different occasions, so I wasn't indicted. But this conspiracy called gang stalking or targeted individual, it's just this paranoia thing where people think that they are being targeted. I became the poster child for them. I validated all of these nebulous concerns and irrational fears and all these rabbit holes they went down. And even though when people write me, and I get hundreds of letters from these people who think that they're being targeted by governments or unknown entities, actually a lot, on my website, that I wrote an essay about it, and it is the #1 piece on my website by far. It's so that piece versus anything else I post regularly is the #1 piece. And what I think is the internet also allows conspiracies to develop and flourish with no questioning, right? So in the case of gang stalking, there was no websites on it before. In 2005, the first website appeared. I wasn't the poster child then. I didn't become the poster child until 2011. So one website appears, and then a couple of years later there's 5 or 10, and now there's thousands of them. But they all basically have the same information. None of them present any new information, and they tell you how gang stalking works, but it doesn't tell you why. Why are people being targeted? And then, so when I ask people, when they would write me these really very sincere letters, I'm being targeted, I'm like, you're not being targeted, I can tell you. and the answers were, well, I signed a petition once in the 1980s, or I made my boss mad 3 jobs ago, and maybe they're getting back at me, or but the thing is, they're very sincere. I mean, like, I want to laugh, but it's like, it's really like, these are very sincere people who are having a disconnect in their brain. And so, but what happens is that instead of trying to find the reality of it, they've created their alternative realities, and they just go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole that never takes them out. And conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory does this. 9/11, who runs the world, the Bilderbergers and the Rockefellers and all that shit, and you never get to it, right? There's never into it. And what happens is that we begin, the reason I have so many problems with them is because what happens is that when people begin to focus on that, they just leave behind the real stuff that actually is the open conspiracies, that corporations colluded with banks to take money offshore in the United States the last 30 or 40 years. The fact that the Federal Reserve is actually a quasi-private, public entity. That's a real conspiracy. It doesn't involve shape-shifting aliens and all, like all these things. I mean, there's real things that happen that really happen, that if we just follow those and stop wasting our time. The other thing is that charlatans like Alex Jones make a fortune off of it. Glenn Beck makes a fortune off of it, basically selling fear to people. And fear, you cannot make a rational decision based in fear. If you are afraid, you will not make a rational decision. And they sell it day in and day out on their radio programs and their DVD programs and their YouTube channels and all this stuff. And I have a really big problem with that. Not just personally, it just distorts the views. Like, it's already hard to sort stuff out in media, right? Like, all these ideas are already complex. And, like, if you don't have critical thinking, you can't decide between websites that are legitimate, even, like, who's got real information. Well, now you add conspiracy theories to that, and you all of a sudden, people are just spun off in all different directions that take us away from doing the real stuff. Well, I've been inspired by anarchy in Austin. It's one of the reasons I moved here, actually, in 2001, was because there had been a first wave. I mean, I'm not saying before there had been anarchists here before in the 60s and stuff, but then a next wave had come in the 90s when anarchy started to rise in the United States, and there was a big push here. Austin was one of the cities, and I moved here, and it was really inspiring because between like 2001 and about 2006, there could be 1,500 to 2,000 anarchists in the streets at any given demonstration. You would see black flags or black and red flags all over the place. And with the police, we would throw down with the police regularly. And it was with the Austin Police Department. It was great. It was fun, right, for what we were doing. But it's like that kind of crested at some point, and then this whole other generation of anarchists came in, mostly out of what I would consider the liberatory traditions. A lot of inspired by Ron Paul, which I would say is like coming out of a right trajectory. Like whether it's left or right, those paradigms don't matter. And so that kind of came in, and actually I find a lot of ground with people who come out of that trajectory, not because of Ron Paul, because I have nothing to do with electoral politics, but because there's a lot less leftist baggage in it. Even though there's a lot of the same problems of like new activism and things like that, it's coming from a different tradition. And I can agree with it because there's a lot of rural people that have been involved in libertarian I'm just talking about little L libertarian, movements, not the big L libertarian party, that I can identify with them. The age differentials, the people in rural areas that are that agree with these ideas, this is also where I'm from, and so like I find more camaraderie sometimes in that. And then Occupy happened, internationally, definitely in the United States, and that brought up a whole other generation of new anarchists also. And these are all things that are happening simultaneously. It's not like one thing ended and the next thing ended, But so anarchy in Austin is pretty good because we have some institutional things that are happening, like there's Brave New Books, there's Monkey Wrench Books, Treasure City Thrift, Inside Books Project. I mean, many of these things are long-term projects that have gone on for, like 10, 15, 20 years. And then you have a kind of a broad spectrum. Austin is one of the cities that has probably the broadest spectrum of anarchists from different trajectories. And that's a really rare thing because I travel all around the country. I travel internationally, and I don't see it in many other places. I might find it in some places in Oregon, which has very similar ideas. Maybe even Las Vegas, I've seen it, but much more so in Austin. And it's a pretty broad spectrum, and I actually am pretty inspired by it, by seeing people who don't always agree on things but still have these liberatory ideas. I think it's pretty interesting to have these conversations. And I mostly come out of leftist traditions, and so when I go around, it's a very isolated subculture that and very insular, and I don't actually always like it. When I travel to places, I'm like, y'all, there's other people out there. You got to break out of this. I'm like, it's good, but because everybody's trying to figure out their identity and rejecting and all this, they kind of get stuck in it, you know. But I'm like, no, there's other people who are great out there. It's the same, I'm sure, in libertarian circles that I don't run in that much. You know, these other smaller libertarian circles, and but I think Austin is a unique mix, and I hope that it continues to grow, because I think there's actually, if you had to ask me, I say there's several thousand people who are sympathetic to anarchy right now in Austin at this point. I would say there's probably hundreds at the core who could get in the streets or want to build projects, but thousands that are sympathetic. This is the unusual thing about me, is I'm not here to convert anybody to these ideas. I'm not here to say that I have specialized information that nobody has. What I want to do is share these liberatory ideas and experiences so that you may see them, that we all may see them as valuable, and then people begin to build in their communities, right? And that, I think, is a really important distinction, because I don't have to be right in this. In fact, I know I'm not right, and I'm okay with that. I'm just like, this is where I'm struggling along, and we're all doing this together. So in my closing statement, what I would say is that, I've said this in my talks, is that everything in our lives brought us to this moment. Culturally, politically, geographically, personally, brought you to this moment. And every moment is a new moment to begin to open that crack in history. So if we're standing on the edge at every moment, take the blinders off. Take the would, could, should out. Say, I can't do that. We can do anything that we want. So if you're standing on the edge of potential, how is it going to look?